Commander Ethan Hayes stood in the center of the Viridian Tribunal Hall, his eyes scanning the grand alien architecture. Massive stone pillars stretched toward the high ceiling, covered in glowing symbols, and the air buzzed with an unnatural hum, like the energy of an ancient machine. He could feel the weight of hundreds of alien eyes watching him from the darkened balconies above. Each one of these Viridians was a powerful being, strong and proud, their green skin shimmering under the strange lights. And Ethan was just a human, an outsider in their world. He had been brought here after his mission went wrong. What was supposed to be a simple diplomatic assignment on the peaceful planet of Viridian 7 had quickly turned into a nightmare. One misstep, one mistake, and now he was facing the consequences. Commander Hayes, a deep voice echoed from the raised platform at the far end of the hall. The voice belonged to High Judge Thawne, one of the most powerful beings on the planet. His piercing red eyes locked onto Ethan's, and the silence in the room grew heavy. You stand accused of violating sacred Viridian customs. You trampled upon the sacred vines of our ancestors. This is an offense punishable by death. Ethan's heart sank. He had heard of the Viridians' strict customs, but this was extreme. He hadn't meant to disrespect their traditions, but in a moment of carelessness during a diplomatic walk, his foot had brushed against the vines. Now it seemed that single mistake might cost him his life. His mind raced for any way out of this, but the Viridians weren't known for their mercy. The room waited for his response, and he knew this was a moment where hesitation could seal his fate. "Commander," Judge Thawne continued, his voice like thunder, "you are guilty. But the punishment for this crime is negotiable. We offer you a chance to save your life." Ethan blinked. Save his life? How? The judge's next words dropped like a bombshell. "You must marry a Viridian noblewoman," Thawne said, his tone almost casual. "Lady Seraphina of the Viridian House. You will become her mate, her partner, and by doing so, you will repair the damage caused by your actions. In return, your life will be spared." Ethan was stunned. Marry? He could barely understand the implications. A marriage with a Viridian woman, a complete stranger, and all to pay for a mistake with sacred vines. Before he could protest, a figure stepped forward, a woman with radiant green skin and long dark hair that flowed down her back. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, met his, and Ethan felt a strange mix of awe and unease. This must be Lady Seraphina, the woman he was supposed to marry. She was tall, elegant, and carried herself with a kind of authority that was almost intimidating. Despite the beauty of her appearance, there was something about her gaze that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He had never met someone like her before. She was not just an alien. She was a noble, a person with power, and in this strange place, she held a kind of control over his fate. "Commander Hayes," Lady Seraphina spoke, her voice smooth but filled with purpose. "I understand this may seem strange to you, perhaps even unfair, but in Viridian society, our customs are not to be questioned. This marriage, while unconventional, is the only way to restore balance." Ethan's mind was spinning. He had no idea what to say. The idea of marrying someone he didn't know, someone from an entirely different species, felt insane. He wanted to refuse, to stand up and fight. But what could he do? The Viridians were a powerful race. Refusing might mean death, and death was not an option. I don't understand," Ethan said, his voice quiet but laced with frustration. "You're offering me a chance to live. If I marry her, just like that." Lady Seraphina met his gaze with a curious look, her eyes studying him carefully. "It is not just marriage, Commander. It is a union that binds two worlds. This is how we atone for the wrongs done to our people. You must become part of us, just as we must become part of you. You will be honored, respected, and in return, you will help us grow stronger." Ethan felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. He had thought this was just a simple diplomatic mission. But now it seemed like his life, His future was in the hands of a green-skinned alien noblewoman, and a council that seemed to expect him to bend to their will. Before he could speak again, Judge Thawne interjected. "You have 24 hours to decide, Commander Hayes," he said with finality. "Refuse, and you will face the consequences. Accept, and the marriage will be arranged." The hall was silent, and all eyes were on him. Ethan's heart raced as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. His life was at stake, and he had no choice but to consider it. Lady Seraphina gave him a long, thoughtful look before turning her gaze to the judge. "Give him time," she said, her voice calm yet unyielding. "He will need it." With that, the room began to empty, and Ethan was left standing in the middle of the hall, uncertain of what to do next. He had never imagined a situation like this, but here he was, with his life on the line, and an unexpected proposal that would change everything. Ethan sat in a small room, his mind racing. The weight of the Viridian Tribunal's decision still hung over him like a dark cloud. He had 24 hours to decide whether to marry Lady Seraphina or face death. The room was quiet, but his thoughts were anything but. He paced back and forth, trying to make sense of the situation. How had everything gone so wrong? One moment, he was on a simple diplomatic mission, and the next, he was being forced into an arranged marriage with a woman he didn't even know. The door to the room opened without warning, and Ethan looked up to find Lady Seraphina standing in the doorway. She was tall, graceful, and yet there was something about her presence that made Ethan uneasy. Her green skin shimmered softly in the light, and her dark hair flowed down her back like silk. She didn't seem at all fazed by the gravity of the situation, as though this was just another day for her. "You're thinking too much," she said, her voice cool and calm. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I'm supposed to marry you, and I'm thinking too much," he said, his voice a little sharper than he intended. "I don't even know you. I'm a human. You're an alien. How is any of this supposed to work?" Lady Seraphina stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. She didn't seem bothered by his outburst. "I'm not here to explain everything to you, Commander," she said, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. "I'm here to offer you something different, something you might not understand now, but I hope you will in time." Ethan frowned. "And what's that supposed to mean?" She paused for a moment, as if considering how to explain things in a way he could grasp. "You're not just marrying me to save your life. That's the easy part. The harder part is understanding that by joining us, you're becoming part of something much bigger than yourself. You're part of a race that has existed for thousands of years, with a history and power that is, well, it's difficult for you to even imagine." Ethan wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he felt a flicker of something. Was she being sincere, or was this just another part of the game? He didn't know, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she was letting on. "I'm not sure I understand," he said, his voice softer now. "You're saying that this marriage isn't just about me. It's about what exactly?" Lady Seraphina smiled, a mysterious glint in her eyes. "It's about the future, Commander. The future of both our peoples. You're not just some random human to me. You're a key part of a new future, a future where Viridians and humans can work together. But only if we can find common ground." She paused, letting her words sink in. Ethan was quiet, trying to process everything she had said. He had always known that the Viridians were a powerful race, but now he realized that they were much more than that. They had their own plans, their own agenda, and he was suddenly a part of it. "But why me?" he asked, his voice low. "Why not one of your own people?" Lady Seraphina took a step closer. "Because I chose you," she said simply. "Not because you're special, but because you're an outsider. You see the world differently. You're not tied down by the old ways of our people. You don't know the politics, the grudges, the history. You're a blank slate, and that makes you valuable." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "So you're using me as a pawn in your game?" She didn't flinch. "Perhaps, But you're not entirely wrong. We all have our roles to play. The question is, what role will you choose? He wanted to argue, to fight back. But the truth was, he didn't have much of a choice. If he refused this marriage, he would die. And death wasn't an option. So, what happens after this? Marriage? He asked, trying to change the subject, trying to focus on what lay ahead. Do we just live together, pretending everything is fine? Or is there more to this? Lady Seraphina's smile softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw something genuine in her eyes. I don't expect you to just pretend, Commander, she said. I expect you to help me, to understand what it means to be part of my world. And in turn, I will help you understand what it means to be human. Ethan studied her, trying to read her face. Was she sincere? Or was this just another tactic to manipulate him? He couldn't be sure, but something in her voice told him that she was telling the truth. All right, he said finally, his decision made. I'll marry you. But I'm not doing this because I want to. I'm doing this because I don't have a choice. Lady Seraphina nodded, as if she had expected that answer. You'll have a choice soon enough, Commander. You'll see that we're not so different, you and I. Ethan wasn't sure if he believed her, but one thing was clear. His life had just taken a turn he hadn't seen coming, and whatever happened next, he would have to play along. The question was, how would this marriage change both their lives? And more importantly, how would it affect the future of humanity? Lady Seraphina turned toward the door, pausing just before she left. I'll give you time to think. But remember, your time is running out. And with that, she was gone, leaving Ethan alone to wrestle with the gravity of the decision he had just made. The day of the wedding arrived faster than Ethan had expected. He barely had time to adjust to the idea of marrying Lady Seraphina. The thought weighed on him. He had never imagined himself in this position. A few days ago, he had been a simple officer in the human military. And now, he was about to be married to a green-skinned alien noblewoman on a planet that was nothing like Earth. The ceremony was to take place in the heart of the Viridian capital, a massive hall made of smooth, glowing stone. The air was thick with the smell of strange flowers and the low hum of energy fields that surrounded the building. Hundreds of Viridians, from noble houses to common citizens, had gathered to witness this rare event. Ethan stood at the altar, his uniform slightly uncomfortable, surrounded by alien customs he still didn't fully understand. His eyes shifted nervously as he waited for Lady Seraphina to arrive. The hall was massive, with intricate carvings and bioluminescent plants decorating every corner. Viridians had a way of making everything feel ancient yet alive, as though the planet itself was watching. The people in the audience whispered among themselves, their eyes fixed on Ethan, sizing him up. To them, he was a curiosity, an outsider, a human marrying one of their own. Ethan's palms were sweaty, and his heart raced in his chest. This wasn't how he had imagined his life turning out. He was supposed to represent humanity in this alien galaxy, not become part of a marriage that felt like a political trap. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened. Lady Seraphina walked in, her green skin glowing softly in the light. She wore a long, flowing gown made of fabric that shimmered like the stars. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant style, and her eyes were focused, determined. She walked toward him with confidence, not a hint of doubt in her posture. Ethan couldn't help but notice how striking she looked, even though he barely knew her. She was beautiful, but there was more to her than just her appearance. She carried herself with authority, as if she had always been destined for this moment. As Seraphina reached him, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this whole ceremony was a show. It was all too perfect, too calculated. The Viridians were known for their attention to detail, and this wedding was no exception. The air seemed to thrum with a kind of energy, as if the very walls of the hall were alive, watching, waiting. The High Judge Thawne stepped forward and began to speak in a language Ethan didn't fully understand. It was a beautiful, flowing language, but it also seemed to carry an undertone of power. Ethan barely followed the words, focusing instead on Serafina, who stood beside him with a calm, serene expression. Her hand brushed his arm briefly, and he couldn't help but notice how cold her touch was. Not unpleasantly so, but as if she were somehow not entirely human. Then it was his turn to speak. He wasn't sure what to say, so he simply repeated the words the judge had told him to say. The Viridians did not have a tradition of exchanging vows the way humans did. Instead, they had something else, an energy bond that connected the two of them. The High Judge placed his hands over their joined ones, and Ethan felt an electric jolt run through his body. It wasn't painful, but it was strange. It was as though their minds were touching, briefly, connected by an invisible thread. The bond was more than just symbolic. It was real. The Viridians believed that through this bond, two people became more than just partners. They became one. Their thoughts, their emotions, would be intertwined. Ethan didn't know how to feel about it. This was all too much, too fast. He was still trying to understand why this marriage was necessary, why he was even here. Once the bond was sealed, the ceremony continued with a series of traditional rituals. Serafina touched his shoulder in a gesture of solidarity, and Ethan realized that this was happening. This was real. He was now married, in front of hundreds of Viridian witnesses, and this bond wasn't something he could just walk away from. After the ceremony ended, Ethan and Serafina were escorted to a private chamber in the palace. The air inside was cooler, and the space was decorated with more strange, glowing plants. There was a large bed, a sitting area, and enough space for both of them to feel isolated from the rest of the world. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, trying to collect his thoughts. This room, this marriage, everything felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. He couldn't tell anymore. Serafina moved to the other side of the room, her back to him. "I know this is a lot for you," she said softly, her voice almost too gentle. "It wasn't my choice either. But now that it's done, we can move forward. We can work together, learn from each other." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure if he trusted her. After all, he had been thrown into this situation by the Viridian court, not by his own choice. But there was something about her, something that made him hesitate. She was different from the cold, calculating politicians he had dealt with. She had an air of authority, yes, but she also seemed human. "How long are we supposed to keep up this act?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Serafina turned, meeting his gaze. Her eyes were calm, but there was a fire behind them. "It's not an act," she said, her voice firm. "This marriage is real. Our worlds will be linked. And whether you like it or not, you're part of my world now." Ethan looked at her, unsure of what to say. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. What had started as a forced union was quickly becoming something more complex, and soon they would both have to face the challenges that lay ahead, together. Ethan's first few days in his new life felt like a blur. He was now married to Lady Serafina, a Viridian noblewoman, and he was expected to adjust to an entirely new world. The planet Viridian 7 was unlike anything he had ever seen on Earth. The air was thick with the scent of strange flowers, and the landscape was dominated by massive green forests, crystal-clear lakes, and towering mountain ranges that seemed to stretch on forever. The sky was always a shade of violet, even during the day, and the two moons that circled the planet added an eerie glow to the night. The palace where he and Serafina lived was a vast, imposing structure made of sleek, black stone and covered in glowing bioluminescent plants. The halls were silent, the only sound the soft hum of the planet's energy fields. It was beautiful, but also alien and distant. Ethan felt like a tiny speck in this grand world, unsure of where he fit into the picture. Serafina had given him space in the beginning, allowing him to explore the palace and the city at his own pace. The first few days had been awkward, filled with long silences and strange customs that he didn't fully understand. The Viridians had their own way of doing things, different from anything Ethan had known. But even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The Viridians, it seemed, were always aware of his movements. One afternoon, after several days of solitude, Serafina came to him with a proposition. "It's time we begin the next part of our union," she said, her voice calm but firm. She stood in the doorway of his chambers, looking as composed as ever. "We need to go to the city center. There is something important I must show you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "The city center? What's going on there?" Serafina stepped into the room, her long gown trailing behind her. "It is a tradition for newly united couples to present themselves to the people. They must show that they are in harmony, that the bond is real. The Viridian people expect us to demonstrate our commitment to one another." Ethan felt a wave of unease. The idea of presenting himself to the entire Viridian population sounded overwhelming. He wasn't sure he was ready to be put on display. But there was no backing out. Not now. "All right," he said, standing up and adjusting his uniform. "Let's get it over with." The journey to the city center was a short one. They walked through the palace gardens, past beautiful fountains and large statues of Viridian ancestors, until they reached the central plaza. It was a bustling place, filled with Viridian citizens going about their daily lives. The city was a mix of advanced technology and nature, with buildings made of stone and glass intertwined with trees and plants. As they approached, the crowd began to take notice. The Viridians were curious, their eyes fixed on Ethan and Serafina as they walked together. They spoke in hushed tones, and Ethan could feel their gaze on him. He tried to stand tall, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. He was the only human here, the only one who wasn't part of their world. Serafina, however, seemed unfazed. She walked beside him with the same confident, poised demeanor she always had. The crowd parted as they reached the central platform, where the Viridian leaders often addressed the public. A large screen above them flickered to life, showing the faces of several high-ranking Viridians. High Judge Thawne was among them. His red eyes scanned Ethan and Serafina with a mix of curiosity and approval. "Welcome, Commander Hayes," Thawne's voice boomed through the plaza. "And welcome, Lady Serafina. Today, we celebrate the union between our people and yours. This is not just a marriage. It is the beginning of a new chapter in Viridian history." The crowd cheered, but Ethan could hear the tension in the air. This wasn't just a celebration. It was a test to see if the union between him and Serafina would work, a test to see if humans and Viridians could coexist. And Ethan, though he didn't fully understand the stakes, could feel the pressure. Serafina stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "I am proud to stand here with Commander Hayes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This union will bring our two worlds closer together. And through this bond, we will create a future where both our peoples can thrive." Ethan stood next to her, trying to appear confident. He wasn't used to being the center of attention like this, especially in a place that felt so foreign. But there was nothing to do except stand there and support Serafina. It was part of the deal. And in this moment, he had no choice but to play his part. The crowd's applause was loud, but Ethan's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't help but wonder what would come next. Would this marriage really help bridge the gap between humans and Viridians? Or was he simply a pawn in some larger game, a piece to be moved when needed? After the ceremony, Serafina led Ethan to a quiet terrace overlooking the city. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the vast landscape. The atmosphere was peaceful, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in his chest. "You did well," Serafina said, her voice softer than before. "The people are pleased." Ethan nodded, but he wasn't sure he felt pleased himself. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," he admitted. "This marriage, this whole thing, it doesn't feel real to me." Serafina turned to him, her eyes thoughtful. "I understand. It's not easy. But remember, Commander, this union is bigger than us. It's about the future of both our peoples. You may not see it now, but in time, you will. Ethan looked out at the city below, the lights twinkling in the distance. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. He was stuck in this alien world now, and whether he liked it or not, his life was forever changed. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan was still trying to find his place in this strange new life. The palace was grand, the food was exotic, and the customs were unlike anything he had known on Earth. But despite all the newness, the emptiness lingered. He was trapped in a world that wasn't his own, bound by a marriage he never asked for, and surrounded by people who saw him as both a curiosity and a symbol of something far bigger than himself. Lady Seraphina, though kind and composed, remained an enigma. She was always there, guiding him through the traditions and rituals, but never revealing too much about herself. She had been patient with him, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her than she was letting on. The marriage, after all, wasn't just about the union between them. It was about something much larger. But what exactly? One evening, after another long day of ceremonial meetings and diplomatic gatherings, Ethan sat alone in his chambers. The room was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the palace's energy system. He had just finished another boring meeting with Viridian officials, and his mind was reeling. He had no idea how to bridge the cultural gap between humans and Viridians, and he was beginning to wonder if he ever would. The pressure was mounting, and the stakes were high. As he stared out the window at the violet sky, his thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. "Come in," he said, not bothering to turn around. The door opened slowly, and Seraphina stepped into the room. She was wearing a simple robe, her green skin glowing softly in the dim light. She looked serene as always, but there was something different about her tonight. She seemed hesitant. "Commander," she said, her voice a little quieter than usual. "I need to talk to you." Ethan turned to face her, raising an eyebrow. "What's going on?" he asked, feeling the tension in the air. Seraphina looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the fabric of her robe. "There is something I must tell you, something I should have told you sooner." Ethan's curiosity was piqued. "What is it?" She took a deep breath and walked toward him, sitting down beside him on the edge of the bed. Her eyes were serious, focused, and for the first time, Ethan could see the vulnerability in them. "The Viridian court has plans," she began, her voice low. "Plans that go beyond just our marriage. You're not here just as my husband. You're here as a key player in a much larger scheme. A scheme that involves both Viridians and humans." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about? What kind of plans?" Seraphina hesitated, her eyes searching his face, as if deciding how much to reveal. "There are factions within the Viridian court that want to unite our two races, but not just through marriage. They want to merge our civilizations in a way that's unprecedented. It's a radical plan, and not everyone agrees with it." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "And you want me to help with this? You want me to be a part of something I don't understand?" Seraphina nodded slowly. "I know this is a lot to take in, but the truth is, you're the key. You're a symbol of the alliance between our two worlds. And while you may not understand the full picture, your presence here is not just about you and me. It's about the future of both our peoples." Ethan stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of what she had just said. "So you're telling me that the court sees me as a pawn in their political games. That's why I'm here. I'm not just a husband to you. I'm a tool to get what they want." Seraphina looked down, her face clouded with regret. "It's not as simple as that. I don't see you as a pawn. I never have. But the reality is that there are powerful forces at work here, forces that are bigger than both of us." Ethan stopped pacing, turning to face her. "And what do you want from me? Do you expect me to just go along with this plan, to help you manipulate my own people?" Seraphina's expression softened. "I don't want to manipulate anyone, but I do believe in the vision. I believe that humans and Viridians can coexist, that we can build something greater together. But it won't be easy. There will be those who resist, both here and on Earth. Ethan felt the weight of her words. The stakes were higher than he had thought. This wasn't just about a marriage anymore. This was about two entire civilizations coming together, or falling apart. And he was in the middle of it all, caught between two worlds that were very different from each other. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice low, a mix of frustration and confusion. "I didn't ask to be the center of this political game. I just wanted to serve my people, to help with this alliance. But now, I don't even know who I can trust." Serafina reached out, gently placing a hand on his arm. "I understand, and I'm sorry for keeping you in the dark, but we don't have time to waste. The factions that oppose this union are already making their move. If we don't act soon, everything we've worked for could fall apart." Ethan looked at her, his mind racing. He wasn't sure if he could trust her, but one thing was clear. This situation was more dangerous than he had ever imagined. There were forces at play that he couldn't control, and his role in all of it was growing more complicated by the hour. He took a deep breath and looked her in the eyes. "What do you want me to do?" Serafina's eyes were filled with a mixture of determination and hope. "I want you to stand with me, to help me protect the future of both our peoples." Ethan nodded slowly. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the answer he had. "All right, I'll stand with you, but you'd better be ready for what's coming next." The tension in the palace had grown palpable. Since the conversation with Serafina, Ethan had been more alert, more aware of the whispers that followed him wherever he went. It wasn't just the Viridian court that was watching him now. It was everyone. He could feel the eyes of the people on him, waiting for him to make his move. They were all waiting for him to take a side. Serafina had made it clear. The political factions in the Viridian court were growing bolder, and if their union wasn't solidified soon, everything they had worked for would fall apart. The plan was risky, dangerous even, but the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. The future of both Viridians and humans rested on the fragile alliance that was beginning to fray at the edges. Ethan spent his days meeting with advisors, Viridian officials, and even members of the human delegation who had come to the planet to assist with the alliance. But no matter where he went, there was an undercurrent of unease that followed him. It wasn't just the political games being played. There was something else, something hidden beneath the surface. One evening, as the sky turned a deep violet and the palace lights flickered on, Ethan found himself in a secluded corner of the palace gardens. He had been given little time to think for himself since his arrival, but now, with the cool air surrounding him, he finally had a moment of peace. Serafina had been distant lately. After their conversation about the plan, she had become more focused, more guarded. Ethan knew she was trying to protect him, but part of him still didn't trust the path they were walking. He wasn't sure who to trust anymore, not even her. As he leaned against a stone pillar, lost in thought, a voice startled him from behind. "You've been avoiding the discussions lately." Ethan turned to see a familiar face, General Valthor, a high-ranking Viridian military officer and one of the most influential members of the Viridian court. Valthor's sharp features were softened only by the light glow of his skin, and his eyes, a piercing silver, studied Ethan with a level of intensity that made him uneasy. "I've just been thinking," Ethan replied cautiously. Valthor chuckled darkly. "I imagine you have. You're in the middle of something much bigger than you realize. I think you understand that by now." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you think I realize, General?" Valthor stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That you're being used. You're a tool in this grand scheme, Hayes. Don't fool yourself into thinking it's anything more than that." Ethan's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not blind to what's going on here, but I'm trying to make the best of it." Valthor smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. "You're playing a dangerous game, Commander. This isn't about making the best of anything. The court is divided, and not all of us are in favor of this alliance. If you're not careful, you'll find yourself in the middle of a war you can't win." Ethan's mind raced. A war? What was Valthor talking about? He had heard rumors of unrest, but this sounded like something more serious. I didn't come here to start a war, Ethan said, his voice low. I came here to do what's best for both our peoples. Valthor studied him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer but no less intense. You think you're helping, but you're just a pawn. You've been dragged into something you can't control, something far more dangerous than you realize. Before Ethan could respond, Valthor turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the palace gardens. Ethan stood there for a long time, trying to digest what had just been said. Was the general right? Was he just a pawn in a game of political chess? The idea gnawed at him, but he wasn't ready to believe it just yet. The next day, Serafina invited him to a private meeting in the palace's highest tower. As he entered the room, the windows revealed a breathtaking view of the planet below. Vast green forests and towering mountains under a violet sky. It was beautiful, but it felt distant, almost surreal. Serafina was standing near the window, looking out at the horizon. She turned as he entered, her face calm, but her eyes betraying the tension she had been hiding. Ethan, we need to discuss the next phase of the plan, she said, her voice firm but gentle. The situation is becoming more complicated. The factions are moving faster than I anticipated, and there are things I can't tell you just yet. But you need to trust me. This is the only way forward. Ethan's heart raced as he stepped closer to her. You keep saying I need to trust you. But what if you're leading me down the wrong path? What if the plan isn't what we think it is? Serafina's gaze softened, but there was a hardness in her voice. I can't explain everything right now. But trust me, this union is necessary. It's the only way to prevent a larger conflict. You may not understand it all yet, but you will. We need to work together to ensure that both our peoples have a future. Ethan felt conflicted. He wanted to believe in the vision Serafina had painted, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play than she was letting on. The warning from General Valthor echoed in his mind. Was he truly a pawn in someone else's game? Do you trust me? Serafina asked, her voice softer now. Ethan hesitated. For the first time since he had arrived on Viridian 7, he wasn't sure. There were so many unknowns, so many secrets yet to be uncovered. I don't know anymore, he admitted quietly. Serafina looked at him with a mixture of concern and determination. Then you need to decide, Ethan. Because the path ahead won't be easy, and if we don't make the right choices now, there may be no way back. Ethan's mind was in turmoil as he left the high tower where he had just spoken with Serafina. Her words echoed in his ears, but the more he thought about it, the more he felt the weight of the decision he was being asked to make. Trust her or walk away. He wasn't sure he could do either. As the days passed, the tension in the palace grew. The factions within the Viridian court were becoming more vocal, and whispers of rebellion spread like wildfire. It was clear that not everyone was on board with the union between the humans and Viridians, and some of the most powerful leaders were willing to do whatever it took to stop it. Ethan had learned that these factions were not just political. They were deeply ideological, believing that the two species should remain separate, not merge into one. Ethan spent long nights in his chambers, staring out at the alien landscape below, trying to piece together the truth. General Valthor's warning still haunted him, and though he tried to dismiss it, something about the general's words felt true. He was a pawn, caught in a game he didn't fully understand. But he couldn't ignore the other side of the story. The bond he had with Serafina, the vision of peace that she believed in, and the promise of a better future for both peoples. But was it worth the cost? On the 7th day after his conversation with Serafina, Ethan was summoned to a secret meeting. It wasn't with Serafina this time, but with a group of Viridian leaders, some of whom he had never seen before. The atmosphere was tense, the room dimly lit, as if they were hiding from someone. As he entered, the leaders greeted him with formal nods, their eyes cold, calculating. At the head of the table sat a Viridian elder with glowing amber eyes. His name was Counselor John, and he was known for his strong stance against the human alliance. "Commander Hayes," John said, his voice smooth but edged with authority. "We've been watching you." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Watching me?" John's eyes narrowed. "Yes. You're a symbol, Commander. A symbol of the merging of our two races, and some of us don't like what you represent." Ethan straightened, his hands clenching into fists. "What do you want from me?" The counselor's lips curled into a thin smile. "We want to give you a choice that will determine the future of your people and ours." A chill ran through Ethan. "What kind of choice?" John's voice was low and dangerous. "You can support the Union and stand by Lady Seraphina, or you can join us and help stop it. If you choose the latter, we can promise you a place of power in the future Viridian government, one where humans and Viridians can live apart as separate nations. No merging, no forced alliance." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The offer was tempting. Power, influence, the chance to be part of a new world where humans could remain independent. But at what cost? Could he really turn his back on Seraphina and the dream of a united future? "And if I refuse?" Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. John's smile faded. "Then you'll remain as a figurehead, a pawn, as you have been all along. We will use you to further our cause, just as the court has. But you won't have any true power. You'll be nothing more than a tool in the game." Ethan stood there in silence, his mind racing. He thought of Seraphina, of the life they could build together. He thought of the people who believed in the Union, who believed in the possibility of peace between humans and Viridians. And then he thought of the rebels, the factions who wanted to tear it all down, to keep the two races separate. What was the right choice? Was he helping to build a future, or was he simply walking into a trap? Before he could speak, a soft voice interrupted. "He's not going to join you." It was Seraphina. She had entered the room without anyone noticing, her presence as commanding as ever. She stood tall, her eyes locked on John. "Lady Seraphina," John said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "How predictable. But you can't control him, not anymore. The truth is, Commander Hayes has a choice. He's not bound to you." Ethan turned to Seraphina, his heart pounding. "I don't know what to believe anymore. Seraphina, these factions, they're offering me power. A future where humans don't have to be part of your vision, where we can be separate, where we don't have to merge." Seraphina's gaze softened, but there was a fire in her eyes that Ethan hadn't seen before. "That's what they want, Ethan. They want to keep us apart, to keep us fighting each other forever. But I believe in something better. I believe in us." Ethan's mind whirled. The decision was now in his hands, and there was no turning back. He couldn't trust the factions who wanted to tear everything apart, but he couldn't ignore the risks that came with standing beside Seraphina. "What happens if I choose you?" he asked quietly. Seraphina took a step forward, her voice filled with conviction. "Then we fight together, Ethan. We fight for a future where both our peoples can live in peace, side by side. It won't be easy, but we can make it work. We have to." Ethan looked at her, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could see the passion in her eyes, the hope she had for the future, and in that moment, he knew what he had to do. "I choose you," he said, his voice firm. Seraphina smiled, and for the first time since arriving on Viridian 7, Ethan felt like he had made the right choice. Together, they would face whatever came next. The storm was coming, but they would face it together.